In the fall of 2022, a retired Michigan conservation officer sat down with a stack of case files he was never supposed to keep copies of and told us why. For over a decade, he and every warden he trained believed the Dogman was not the most dangerous thing in the woods of Baraga County. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from, and if you've had an encounter like this. The man who gave us those files spent 26 years as a Michigan Department of Natural Resources conservation officer patrolling the western Upper Peninsula, most of it out of the Baraga field station, and we are going to call him Neil. He asked us to change his name because of what happened to a colleague of his who did not keep quiet, and once you hear that part of the story, you will understand exactly why Neil wanted that protection. Neil retired in his late 50s after a career that took him through the Huron Mountains, the Sturgeon River Gorge, and the long stretch of hardwood and hemlock forest that climbs away from the shore of Keweenaw Bay toward the height of land that separates the Lake Superior watershed from the Ontonagon drainage. He knew Dogman reports were part of the job the way every conservation officer in that part of the state knows it. What he did not expect, 12 years into his career, was to find evidence of something that appeared to be killing them. Baraga County sits in the western Upper Peninsula, bounded by Lake Superior to the north and east, with the Keweenaw Bay Indian Community's reservation lands occupying a significant portion of the shoreline and the interior. The county is enormous by downstate standards and nearly empty, just under 9,000 people spread across 905 square miles, most of them concentrated in Lance and Baraga at the head of the bay. Everything south and west of those two towns is forest. The Ottawa National Forest covers much of the interior, broken up by state forest land, private timber holdings, and the rugged, largely roadless terrain of the Huron Mountains, which rise to over 1,800 feet and hold some of the last stands of old-growth hemlock and sugar maple left in the Midwest. This is not gentle country. The Sturgeon River cuts a gorge through volcanic rock deep enough that portions of it are inaccessible except by rope, and the interior uplands are laced with beaver flowages, cedar swamps, and second-growth forests so dense that a conservation officer on foot patrol can lose sight of his own truck within 50 yards. Neil grew up in nearby Houghton County, the son of a copper country machinist, and enrolled at Michigan Technological University, intending to study mining engineering before switching to wildlife biology in his second year. He was hired by the DNR Law Enforcement Division in the mid-1990s, went through the academy in Lansing, and requested assignment back to the Upper Peninsula, where he had grown up hunting grouse and running a trap line with his father along the Sturgeon River drainage. He got his wish. For the better part of 3 decades, his patrol area covered roughly 400 square miles of the roughest country in Baraga County, and he came to know it the way a man knows the inside of his own house in the dark. He could put a name to a beaver pond from a quarter-mile away by the shape of the dam. He could tell you which 2-track had washed out before he reached it, based on how the birds were behaving along the road. That kind of knowledge does not come from reading maps. It comes from tens of thousands of hours spent on the ground. And it is the reason Neil's account carries the weight it does. He is not a man prone to misreading sign. Conservation officers in Michigan are full peace officers with statewide jurisdiction, trained in the same academy as state troopers, armed and authorized to make arrests, and tasked with everything from poaching enforcement to search and rescue to boating accidents. It is a job that puts a person alone in remote country at all hours, in all weather, dealing with situations that range from routine license checks to violent confrontations with armed poachers. Neil qualified annually with his service weapon, held certifications in wilderness first response and technical rescue, and had, over his career, been involved in 3 officer-involved shootings, none of which resulted in a fatality, all of which were ruled justified. This is relevant because Neil is not a man whose nerve breaks easily. He has faced down armed men in the dark. What happened in the Sturgeon River country in 2006 was different from anything his training had prepared him for, and it took him most of 2 decades to talk about it on the record. Dogman reports were nothing new to Neil by 2006. He had been fielding them since his rookie years, usually secondhand, from hunters who described something large and upright crossing a 2-track at dusk, or from cabin owners who reported livestock disturbances they could not explain. The DNR's official position then and now, is that these reports describe misidentified black bears, and Neil had spent years operating under that assumption himself, chalking up the stranger reports to poor lighting, adrenaline, and the tendency of the human mind to fill gaps with something more dramatic than a startled bear standing on its hind legs. He had never seen anything himself that shook that assumption. Then, in September of 2006, he responded to a call about a dead moose on state forest land 11 miles south of Lens, and everything he thought he understood about the woods he had patrolled for a decade came apart in about 40 minutes. The call came from a bow hunter who had been scouting a ridge above a beaver flowage for the upcoming season and had come across the carcass in a small clearing. Moose are not common in Baraga County, the Upper Peninsula's moose population, re-established through a translocation program from Ontario in the 1980s and 1980s, numbers only a few hundred animals concentrated mostly farther west in Marquette and Iron counties, with occasional individuals ranging into Baraga County along the forest corridors. A dead moose was significant enough that Neil drove out himself, rather than sending a technician, both to document the cause of death for the DNR's ongoing moose monitoring program, and because an unexplained moose death this far from the core range was worth a careful look. What he found when he reached the clearing did not match anything in his training. The moose, an adult cow that field necropsy would later estimate at close to 900 pounds, had not been killed by wolves, which was Neil's working assumption on the drive out. Wolf kills on moose in the Upper Peninsula follow a recognizable pattern. Multiple animals working together, hamstringing the legs, wearing the moose down over a pursuit that can cover a mile or more, with bite marks and tissue damage concentrated on the hindquarters and flanks. This moose showed a single wound. The neck had been broken, the spinal column separated at the third cervical vertebra with a rotational force that Neil, who had processed hundreds of deer and had a working knowledge of ungulate anatomy from his own hunting, could not attribute to any predator native to the region. There were no bite marks consistent with wolf dentition anywhere on the carcass. There was a single set of deep puncture wounds at the base of the skull, spaced in a pattern too wide for wolf jaws and too narrow and precise for a bear's bite, which tends to be crushing rather than puncturing.
Quick thing before we move on, I have this book coming out. It's called the Dogmen Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. Been working on it for a long time, so if you want to check that out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
The moose had been dragged. That was the detail that stopped Neil in the clearing with his notebook in hand. Drag marks in the moss and disturbed leaf litter led from an opening in the tree line roughly 40 yards to where the carcass lay, and the drag path showed a continuous furrow, rather than the intermittent scuffing you would expect from multiple wolves worrying a carcass along. A single drag mark, consistent depth, as if one animal had gripped the moose by the neck or shoulder and pulled it the entire distance without setting it down. Neil has processed enough black bear predation sites and deer winterkill scenes to know what dragging by multiple smaller predators looks like versus what a single large predator moving a 900-pound animal by itself would look like. This was the second kind, and there is no predator on the official Michigan species list capable of moving 900 pounds of dead moose 40 yards through mixed timber by itself. Neil radioed his partner that day, another conservation officer we will call Warren, who covered the adjoining patrol district to the south and had worked alongside Neil for the better part of a decade by that point. Warren drove out to the site, and the two of them spent close to 3 hours documenting the scene, photographing the wound pattern, casting what partial tracks they could find in the softer ground near the flowage, and trying to construct an explanation that fit inside the boundaries of known Michigan wildlife. They could not make one work. The tracks near the carcass were the most troubling piece, mixed in with the moose's own hoofprints and a scattering of what looked like coyote sign drawn to the kill after the fact. They found 2 partial impressions that were neither hoof nor paw, roughly 14 inches long, generally humanoid in the placement of what appeared to be a heel and a forward mass of toes, but with a splayed, almost clawed structure at the front that no human foot produces and no bear track resembles. Neil had seen Dogman track reports before, secondhand, described by hunters and hikers over the years, and had filed them mentally alongside every other Bigfoot and Dogman account that crosses a rural law enforcement officer's desk sooner or later, unverified and unverifiable. This was the first time he had knelt over a track like that himself, with a 900-pound moose 15 feet away with its neck broken and no explanation on the books for either one. What Warren said at the kill site that afternoon is something Neil has repeated to us almost word for word, because it reoriented the entire next decade of his career. Warren looked at the wound pattern, looked at the drag furrow, looked at the tracks, and said this did not look like a Dogman kill. He said in 11 years on the job he had heard enough second-hand Dogmen reports from hunters and trappers to have a rough mental profile of what those encounters described, and it was never this. Dogman sightings, in Warren's experience compiling informal notes from the district for years, involved a large upright canine seen at a distance, moving through timber, occasionally investigating camps or vehicles, rarely aggressive, and never associated with kill sites on this scale. What they were looking at in that clearing was something else, something that killed a 900-pound animal with a single application of force to the neck and then moved the body 40 yards, like it weighed nothing. That comment planted a question in Neil's mind that would not leave him alone for the rest of his career. If the Dogman reports coming out of the district described one kind of animal, and the kill site in front of him described the work of something considerably more powerful, was it possible that Baraga County held two distinct undocumented predators rather than one? And if that was true, what was the relationship between them? Neil did not file an official report describing the wound pattern as anything other than probable large predator activity, cause undetermined, pending further investigation, which is language flexible enough to cover a scenario without committing to a specific unlisted species. He kept his own notes, separate from the department file. In a personal notebook he began that September and continued for the rest of his career. Over the following 16 years, that notebook grew to document 11 similar kill sites across his patrol district and the districts of 2 colleagues who eventually began sharing information with him. Once they understood, he took it seriously and would not repeat what bind. They told him. The pattern that emerged across those 11 sites was consistent enough that Neil, a man trained to build cases out of physical evidence, came to treat it as functionally certain, even though it could never be proven to departmental standards. Every kill site involved a large animal, always with sufficient mass to make the kill notable. 2 moose over the 16-year period, 5 adult black bears, 3 white-tailed deer that were large enough and killed cleanly enough to stand out from typical predation, and 1 incident in 2017 that Neil is convinced, though he cannot prove it and has never said so in any official capacity, involved the partial remains of something that was not a listed species at all. Every site showed the same signature, a single, catastrophic application of force to the neck or skull. No feeding pattern consistent with a pack of wolves or coyotes working a kill over time. And in 8 of the 11 sites, drag marks indicating the carcass, or what remained of it, had been moved by a single animal capable of relocating several hundred pounds of dead weight over uneven forested terrain. Neil began, unofficially, calling whatever was responsible the color. Not a name from folklore, not a name he found in any book. It emerged from a conversation with Warren sometime around 2009, when the 2 of them were trying to describe to each other what they thought they were dealing with, without resorting to language that would make either of them sound like they belonged on daytime television instead of in a DNR truck. Warren said it seemed to be culling something, taking out the largest, strongest individuals in a given area with an efficiency that looked less like opportunistic predation and more like population control. The name stuck between the 2 of them and, eventually, among the small handful of other conservation officers Neil brought into his confidence over the years. If you have ever hunted or hiked the country between Lance and the Sturgeon River Gorge, you already know how big that ground is and how little of it sees another human being in a given week. Let us know in the comments if you have ever come across a kill site out there that did not add up, because based on what Neil's notes describe, that stretch of the Ottawa National Forest has a lot more happening in it than the department has ever put on paper. Understanding what Neil believes he was documenting requires understanding what he believes the Dogman itself represents in that part of Michigan, because the color and the Dogmen are not, in his working theory, the same animal, and the relationship between the two is the part of this story that took him the longest to accept. The Upper Peninsula's Dogman reports follow a pattern that has been documented for decades, distinct from, but related to the broader Michigan Dogmen phenomenon that traces back to the 1887 Wexford County lumberjack account and was given wider cultural life by Steve Cook's 1987 radio song, which he wrote as an April Fool's Day prank, before discovering that the calls flooding into his station described real, decades-old encounters that predated anything he had invented. Linda Godfrey's subsequent research across the Great Lakes region, beginning with her coverage of the Beast of Bray Road in Wisconsin in the early 1990s, established the behavioral profile that Upper Peninsula witnesses have described independently for just as long. Large, upright, canine-headed, nocturnal, territorial, associated with water and dense forest cover, generally avoidant of direct human contact, and displaying an intelligence that goes well beyond ordinary animal cognition. Neil had absorbed all of this the way any rural Michigan law enforcement officer absorbs local folklore, filed under things people talk about but that do not show up in incident reports. What changed his understanding was a conversation in the summer of 2011 with a man named Owen, a retired conservation officer who had preceded Neil in the Baraga district by a full generation, and who Neil sought out specifically because Owen had a reputation, before retiring, for taking Dogman reports more seriously than his colleagues thought appropriate. Owen was in his 80s by the time Neil found him, living in a small house outside Skaney on the Keweenaw Bay shoreline, and he agreed to talk once. Neil explained what he had found at the moose kill site 5 years earlier. Neil drove out to Skaney on a Saturday afternoon in July, taking a full day off from his own patrol schedule for the visit, and found Owen sitting on the porch of a small frame house with a clear view of Keweenaw Bay, a retired man in his 80s who still moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had spent decades walking difficult terrain and had learned not to waste effort. Owen listened to Neil's account of the moose kill without interrupting, then sat quietly for long enough that Neil began to wonder whether the older man intended to answer at all. When Owen finally spoke, it was not to confirm or deny anything Neil had described, but to ask a series of careful questions of his own, about the exact location, about the season, about whether Neil had noticed anything unusual about the behavior of birds or other wildlife in the area in the days surrounding the discovery. Neil answered as precisely as he could, and only after that exchange, once Owen seemed satisfied that Neil was describing something he had genuinely witnessed, rather than repeating a second-hand story dressed up for effect, did the older man begin to talk. Owen told Neil something that reframed the entire investigation. He said that in his own 31 years on the job, stretching from the early 1960s into the 1990s, he had come to believe there were two distinct large unclassified animals moving through the Huron Mountains and the Sturgeon River country, and that old-timers in the area, particularly those with ties to the Keweenaw Bay Indian community, had always described them as separate. One was the dogman, as most people understand the term, roughly man-height to slightly taller, canine-headed, generally described moving through timber or standing at forest edges, associated with unsettling vocalizations, but rarely with violence toward livestock or large game. The other was bigger, heavier, far less frequently seen because it was, in Owen's words, smart enough to almost never be seen at all. And it was this second animal that Owen associated with the kind of catastrophic, efficient large animal kills that Neil had documented, starting in 2006. Owen would not use a specific traditional name for either animal, and when Neil pressed him gently, Owen told him plainly that it was not his place to repeat words that belonged to people whose knowledge it was, and that if Neil wanted to understand more, he should ask the tribal community directly, rather than second-hand from a retired white conservation officer who had only ever been told fragments. Neil respected that boundary for the rest of his career, and it is a boundary this account will respect as well. What can be said, because it is a matter of public record and academic documentation rather than closely held tradition, is that Anishinaabe oral tradition across the Great Lakes region, including among Ojibwe communities like the Keweenaw Bay Indian community, includes a broad and well-documented category of powerful, dangerous, non-human beings associated with specific landscapes, some benevolent, some to be avoided, and that this tradition long predates any modern Dogmen sighting, and provides a cultural framework in which large, undocumented, intelligent beings moving through specific territories is neither a new idea nor an imported one. Anthropologists and folklorists who have worked with Ojibwe communities have published extensively on this broader tradition of powerful beings tied to particular places, without needing to specify names or ceremonial details that are not theirs to share, and that is the level at which this account engages with it. What Owen did share, because he considered it a matter of practical safety rather than closely held tradition, was a piece of land management logic that had been passed down through several generations of conservation officers in the district, an informal rule that predated any official DNR policy. Owen said that when he started the job in the early 60s, the officer training him told him there were places in the district you simply did not linger after dark, not because of any regulation, but because previous officers had learned the hard way that certain drainages and certain stretches of the Huron Mountains uplands belonged to something that did not want company. Owen passed that same informal guidance to the officers he trained before he retired, and one of those officers, years later, passed it to Neil, stripped by then of most of its original context, reduced to a habit of avoiding certain two-tracks after dark without anyone quite remembering why the habit started. Neil only understood the full weight of that inherited caution after his conversation with Owen in 2011. The theory Neil developed over the following decade, built from his own kill site documentation, from Warren's independent observations in the adjoining district, and from the fragments Owen was willing to share, was this: the Dogman population in the western Upper Peninsula exists within a landscape that also holds a second, larger, far more elusive predator, one that occupies a position at the very top of the regional food web, above wolves, above black bears, and, based on evidence Neil would not fully confront until later in his career, above the Dogman itself. Neil came to believe the color preyed on Dogmen the way it preyed on moose and bear, when the opportunity presented itself, and that a significant portion of what conventional Dogman researchers describe as Dogman territorial avoidance behavior, the tendency of Dogmen to stay clear of certain drainages, to avoid marking territory in specific areas that otherwise offer excellent habitat, might actually reflect the Dogman population's own avoidance of a predator higher than themselves on the hierarchy. That theory sat unconfirmed in Neil's private notebook for years, a working hypothesis built from circumstantial pattern matching rather than direct evidence, until an incident in October of 2017 gave him something closer to proof. And it is the incident that both convinced him beyond doubt and effectively ended his willingness to keep investigating the subject at all. The call came in from a hunter who had found what he described as an animal carcass unlike anything he had seen, roughly 1.5 miles up a drainage that fed into the Sturgeon River from the west, deep inside the Ottawa National Forest on a stretch of terrain that required a 4-wheel drive truck, and then close to 2 miles on foot to reach. Neil drove out with Warren, both of them now senior officers with more than 20 years each on the job, expecting another large predator kill consistent with the pattern they had been tracking. What they found instead, in a small clearing beside a beaver-dammed stretch of the creek, was something that Neil describes, even now, with visible difficulty finding the right words. The remains were substantially decomposed by the time they were found, likely several days old based on the state of decay and the insect activity Neil documented, which limited what could be determined with certainty. But enough was intact to establish a set of facts that neither man could reconcile with any known animal. The remains were bipedal in basic structure, based on the surviving limb bones and their articulation, roughly 7 feet in overall length based on Neil's measurement from the crown of the skull, which was present, though badly damaged, to the heel. The skull itself, even in its damaged state, showed an elongated structure consistent with a pronounced muzzle, a feature neither man had ever encountered on a human remains recovery, and that immediately called to mind every second-hand Dogman description either of them had heard over their careers. The remaining fur, patchy and degraded but present in several areas, was dark, coarse, and consistent in texture, with descriptions given by hunters over the years who had reported brief Dogman sightings in the district. The cause of death, to the extent either officer felt qualified to assess it in the field, again showed the signature Neil had documented 11 times before, a catastrophic injury to the neck and upper spine, consistent with the same kind of overwhelming rotational or crushing force he had recorded at the moose kill in 2006 and at every large predator kill site since. Whatever had killed this animal had applied a level of force to its neck that neither Neil nor Warren, between them accounting for over half a century of Michigan law enforcement and wildlife experience, could attribute to any combination of known predators working together, let alone acting alone. Neil is careful, even now, about overstating what he can prove from a partially decomposed field recovery, that he did not have the authority or the resources to send to a laboratory capable of confirming a species that does not officially exist. He photographed everything. He and Warren discussed, at length, whether to attempt to preserve any of the remains for independent analysis, and ultimately decided against it, for reasons that go to the heart of why this story has never surfaced through any official channel. Reporting the recovery of unidentified bipedal remains, matching descriptions of a cryptid would have triggered, at minimum, a mandatory psychological fitness evaluation for both officers, a review by their district supervisor, and very likely reassignment away from the district. Either man had spent decades learning. Michigan DNR conservation officers operate under a use of force and incident reporting framework that has categories for human remains, for game animal mortality, and for nuisance wildlife. It has no category, no form, no procedural pathway. For the discovery of what appeared to be the remains of one unclassified cryptid apparently killed by another, Neil and Warren stood in that clearing for the better part of an hour, discussing what they were legally and professionally required to do, and concluded that there was, in practical terms, nothing they could do that would not end both of their careers without producing any outcome that helped anyone, including whatever species they had just found evidence of. They left the remains where they lay. Neil's photographs and his written account of the recovery exist only in his personal notebook. He has shown the photographs to exactly 3 people outside his own family in the years since, one of whom is a former colleague who independently confirmed portions of what Neil had documented, and one of whom is the researcher who eventually connected Neil to this channel. He has never submitted them to any wildlife agency, any university, or any media outlet. For the same reason, he never submitted his kill site documentation over the previous 11 years. There is no institution equipped to receive it, and every institution he could imagine approaching would respond to the claim rather than the evidence, and the claim alone would be enough to end his credibility permanently. What that recovery confirmed for Neil, beyond any reasonable doubt in his own mind, was that the color was real, that it operated at the very top of the food chain in that stretch of the Upper Peninsula, and that the Dogman population Neil had spent his career hearing about secondhand was not the apex predator of that landscape. It was prey, not primary prey, not a population under constant predation pressure, but an occasional target, taken when circumstances allowed. In the same way the color occasionally took a moose or a mature black bear when the opportunity was right and the risk was manageable. That reframing matters enormously for how you should understand every previous Dogman account from the Upper Peninsula, including the ones Godfrey and others have documented for decades. A Dogman that avoids specific drainages, that seems unusually cautious compared to reports from other regions, that maintains a smaller and more elusive territorial footprint than Dogmen described in less contested landscapes, may simply be a population managing its own risk in a landscape that holds something above it. Neil's working theory, developed over a career and never shared publicly until now, is that the western Upper Peninsula's Dogman population is smaller and more secretive than populations reported elsewhere in the state, precisely because it shares its range with a predator that occasionally hunts it, and every behavioral adaptation a prey species develops under that kind of pressure. Heightened caution, smaller territories, greater investment in avoiding detection, is exactly what long-term observers of Upper Peninsula Dogman activity have noted, without ever having an explanation for why. Warren left the department in 2019, 2 years after the creek bottom recovery, retiring earlier than he had originally planned. Neil told us that the two of them spoke less frequently after that incident than they had in the previous 20 years, not because of any falling out, but because neither man particularly wanted to keep revisiting what they had seen in that clearing, and their friendship, which had been built substantially around their shared professional life in a specific landscape, struggled to find new footing once that landscape had become something neither of them could look at the same way again. Warren moved downstate to be near his adult children. Neil stayed in Baraga County through his own retirement in 2022, and he told us that the hardest part of leaving the job was not giving up the badge or the truck or the authority. It was knowing that no one was coming behind him who understood what that particular stretch of forest actually held, and that whatever institutional caution had been passed down informally from officer to officer since at least the 1960s, the quiet habit of avoiding certain drainages after dark was likely to fade out within a generation as the people who understood why it mattered aged out of the department. The Michigan DNR's own database architecture is worth explaining in more detail than Neil himself ever had reason to, because it is the single most concrete piece of evidence for why a pattern this extensive could persist for nearly 3 decades without any institutional response. The department's wildlife resource management system, the software backbone used by conservation officers and wildlife biologists statewide to log incident reports, mortality investigations, and population survey data, was built around a fixed taxonomy of recognized species, each with its own set of required data fields, its own reporting workflow, and its own downstream statistical models used for population estimation and harvest management. An officer investigating a suspected wolf depredation on livestock, for example, enters data into a form specifically designed for wolf-livestock conflict, fields that prompt for bite spacing, feeding pattern, and site characteristics consistent with documented wolf behavior. There is no equivalent form for an unclassified species, and there is no free text field robust enough to feed into any statewide pattern recognition process, because the entire system was designed around the assumption that Michigan wildlife falls within a known, finite list. An officer facing something outside that list has exactly one practical option within the system as built: log the incident under the closest available category, typically cause undetermined or large predator, unconfirmed, and move on. That single design decision, made by software architects and department administrators with no awareness that it would ever matter to a case like Neil's, is functionally what kept his findings and Roger's findings from ever intersecting for nearly 2 decades, despite both men working adjoining districts documenting the same phenomenon. It is not secrecy, it is architecture. And architecture can suppress a pattern just as effectively as a deliberate decision to hide one, without anyone ever having to make that decision at all. Neil's wife, a school teacher who spent her career at the elementary school in Lance, knew for years that something about the job weighed on him differently than the ordinary stresses of rural law enforcement, the poaching cases, and the search and rescue calls, and the long solitary hours on patrol. She did not learn the specifics until relatively late in his career, well after the 2017 recovery, when Neil finally told her the full history over the course of several difficult conversations. She told us, in a brief phone call she agreed to on the condition that we not use her name either, that what struck her most was not fear for her husband's physical safety, which she had lived with as a matter of course for the entire length of their marriage, but the isolation the knowledge had created in him. A man who had spent his whole career being the person other people called when something in the woods did not make sense, had spent the second half of that same career sitting on the one thing that made the least sense of all, unable to call anyone himself. She described the years before he finally told her in terms that echo almost exactly what Kurt's wife and Dwayne's wife described in an entirely different investigation this channel has covered: a slow accumulation of small, unexplained changes that never added up to anything she could name until she finally had the full picture. Neil stopped taking their grandchildren on the short nature walks he used to lead along a stretch of state forest trail behind their property, trails he had walked with his own children decades earlier and had always been eager to share. He began locking the doors of their house before dark, a habit that had no precedent in nearly 30 years of marriage in a county where most of their neighbors did not lock their doors at all. He started keeping a spotlight in his truck long after retirement, the same heavy-duty unit he had carried on patrol, mounted now on a civilian vehicle that had no professional reason to need one. She said she asked him about the spotlight once, directly, and he told her it was for checking the driveway for deer. An explanation she accepted at the time and now understands was not the truth, or was at best a small, protective piece of a much larger truth he was not yet ready to hand her. What she told us mattered most. Once Neil finally did tell her everything, was not the specific content of what he described, though she does not doubt any of it, having seen enough of his notebook and enough of his photographs over the years since to have formed her own quiet certainty about what he encountered. What mattered most was simply being allowed back into a part of her husband's life she had sensed was closed off to her for the better part of a decade without ever understanding why. She said the marriage did not break under the weight of what Neil was carrying, but it came closer than either of them likes to admit, and that the two of them now consider the eventual disclosure, difficult and overdue as it was, the thing that kept it intact rather than the thing that nearly ended it. The institutional silence surrounding this entire pattern of evidence is not the product of any single decision or any deliberate cover-up. It is the accumulated result of a reporting and classification system that was built to handle known Michigan wildlife and has no mechanism for anything outside that list. The Michigan DNR's large carnivore monitoring program tracks gray wolves, black bears, and the small, contested cougar population in the Upper Peninsula, and every incident report, every mortality investigation, every piece of field data collected by conservation officers and wildlife biologists across the state funnels into a system built around those categories. There is no field for cause of death, unidentified predator, apex, bipedal. There is no procedure for what to do when a decomposed set of remains matches no species in the state's wildlife inventory. Neil is not describing a conspiracy when he describes the silence around his findings. He is describing a bureaucracy that was never designed to process what he found, staffed by people whose careers, like his own, depend on staying within categories the system recognizes. The economic and reputational dimension of that silence is just as real in Baraga County as it would be anywhere else. The Keweenaw Bay Indian community and the surrounding towns depend heavily on tourism, tied to hunting, fishing, and outdoor recreation in the Ottawa National Forest and along the Lake Superior shoreline. A confirmed report of an unclassified apex predator large enough to kill moose and black bears, operating in the same forest blocks used by deer hunters every November, would not simply be a scientific curiosity. It would be an immediate and serious threat to an economy that depends on people believing those woods are safe. Neil understood that calculus as clearly as anyone in the department, and it factored into every decision he made, alongside the more personal calculation of his own career and credibility, not to push his findings further than his private notebook. The behavioral evidence for the color's intelligence, distinct from its raw physical capability, accumulated slowly across Neil's 16 years of documentation, and it is worth walking through, because it is what separates this animal from a simple, large predator and places it, in Neil's assessment, in the same category of unclassified intelligence that Dogmen researchers have long attributed to Dogmen themselves. In 3 of the 11 kill sites Neil documented, the carcass had been deliberately cached, covered with a mounded layer of forest debris, branches and moss and leaf litter pulled together in a pattern too organized to be incidental, a behavior associated with large cats protecting a food cache from scavengers and competitors, but never previously documented in any known Michigan predator, since neither wolves nor black bears reliably cache large kills in this way. In 2 of the sites, Neil found evidence that trail cameras placed nearby by hunters scouting the area, unrelated to his own investigation, had been disabled or physically relocated in the days surrounding the kill. Cameras he was able to examine because the hunters who owned them, confused by the malfunction, mentioned it to him during unrelated licensing checks, never realizing the connection Neil was quietly drawing between their broken equipment and what he had found nearby. The clearest single piece of behavioral evidence came in 2015, at a black bear kill site along a tributary of the Sturgeon River. Neil arrived to document the carcass and found, roughly 30 yards from the kill itself, a deliberate arrangement of the bear's own limb bones, cleaned of tissue, laid in a rough line across a fallen log. Neil has never been able to explain that arrangement to his own satisfaction. It was not consistent with typical scavenging behavior, where bones are scattered and gnawed in the course of feeding. It looked, in his words, deliberate, though he is careful to say he does not know what it meant and has resisted the urge, which he admits he has felt many times over the years, to read too much human intention into behavior from an animal he ultimately understands very little about. What he will say, without hesitation, is that nothing on the official Michigan predator list behaves this way, and that whatever the arrangement meant, it required a level of post-kill engagement with a carcass that goes well beyond feeding. Neil's account connects, in ways he only became aware of after his conversation with the researcher who eventually reached out to this channel, to a small number of scattered reports from elsewhere in the Great Lakes region describing what witnesses have sometimes called, without any consistent terminology, a bigger, meaner thing than the Dogman. A hunter in northern Wisconsin's Chequamegon National Forest described, in an account collected by a separate cryptid research group in the late 2000s, finding a wolf kill site with a wound pattern he could not explain, alongside partial tracks, that he insisted were neither wolf, nor bear, nor anything he recognized, in terrain he had hunted his entire life. A trapper working the Nicolet National Forest in northeastern Wisconsin described, in an account passed secondhand through the same research network, an encounter with something he initially assumed was an unusually large dogman before concluding, based on its proportions and the way it moved, that it was something considerably larger and more powerful than the dogman reports he had heard from other hunters in the same county. Neither account can be independently verified to the standard this channel typically applies, and neither witness has been willing to go on record, but the pattern they describe, a larger, rarer, more dangerous animal existing within dogman range, and apparently preying on or competing with the dogman population itself, matches what Neil documented across 16 years in Baraga County, closely enough that it is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. If you have spent time in the Ottawa National Forest between Lance and the Sturgeon River Gorge, or anywhere in that stretch of the Huron Mountains, you already know how easy it is to go an entire day without seeing another vehicle once you are off the main forest roads. Let us know in the comments whether you have ever come across large carnivore sign out there that the local wardens could not or would not explain, because the pattern Neil documented suggests this is not confined to one drainage or one decade. Neil's retirement in 2022 did not end his relationship with the woods he had patrolled for 26 years, but it changed the terms of that relationship in ways his wife noticed almost immediately. He had planned, for years before he actually retired, to spend his retirement doing exactly what he had done on the job, walking the same drainages, checking on the same beaver flowages, keeping half an eye on wildlife populations out of habit as much as purpose. He did none of that. In the 2 years since he turned in his badge, he has been back into the deep interior of his old patrol district exactly twice, both times during daylight hours in the company of another person, both times sticking to well-traveled trails rather than the roadless backcountry he used to consider his professional territory. He sold the four-wheeler he had used for decades to access the harder-to-reach sections of the district. He no longer hunts deer in the areas he used to prefer, the mixed hardwood ridges above the beaver flowages where he had once tracked wolves and, later, something else, for his own department's monitoring program. He hunts now, when he hunts at all, on private land close to town, land he has personally walked in daylight enough times to be confident nothing unaccounted for is sharing it with him. That withdrawal cost him more than access to good hunting ground. Neil had spent nearly 3 decades being the person in that community who understood the deep woods better than anyone, the man other conservation officers, wildlife biologists, and even experienced local hunters would call when something in the backcountry did not add up. Retirement was supposed to let him keep being that person on his own terms, spending his newly free time doing informally what he had done professionally for 26 years. Instead, the identity he had built his entire adult life around, the man who knew that landscape better than it knew itself, quietly dissolved into something closer to avoidance, and he has had a hard time explaining that shift to people who knew him before 2006, before the moose kill, before he understood what he now believes shares that forest with the dogmen everyone else has spent decades arguing about. The ethical question Neil has wrestled with most, in the years since his retirement, gave him time to actually sit with everything he had documented, is what obligation, if any, he has to the hunters, hikers, and backcountry campers who continue to use that same stretch of the Ottawa National Forest every year without any of the information he spent 16 years accumulating. He has no evidence the color has ever killed a human being, and he is careful, every time this comes up, to say so explicitly. Every documented kill site involved wildlife, and the one recovery that appeared to involve a bipedal creature involved what he believes was a dogman rather than a person. But he also has no evidence that it would not, under the right circumstances, and he has spent a great deal of time thinking about what those circumstances might look like. A solo hunter, deep in a roadless drainage, at the wrong time of day, having stumbled unknowingly onto territory the animal considers its own. He has no way to warn that hypothetical hunter without producing evidence that would destroy his own credibility and, in his estimation, accomplish nothing beyond turning that same stretch of forest into a magnet for exactly the kind of armed, undisciplined attention that would put both the hunter and the animal at far greater risk than either currently faces by simply never crossing paths. That is the position Neil has settled into, uneasily, in his retirement. He believes the risk to the general public is low, based on 16 years of evidence showing a strong and consistent pattern of avoidance, an animal that kills efficiently when it kills, but that appears to invest enormous energy in never being seen doing it, in caching evidence, in disabling the few cameras that have ever come close to capturing it, in operating almost exclusively in the most remote and least visited terrain available to it. He believes that pattern of avoidance is itself the best available protection for the hunters and hikers who continue to use that forest, better than any warning he could issue that nobody in a position of authority would act on anyway. And he believes, though he has a harder time articulating exactly why, that the animal has earned a kind of claim to that ground that supersedes his old professional obligation to manage every acre of it for human use. It was there, in some form, long before the DNR existed to patrol it, long before Michigan was a state, long before the treaties that established the boundaries of the Keweenaw Bay Indian Communities Reservation were signed in the 1840s, carving up a landscape that indigenous communities had already understood, in ways outsiders were never fully given access to, as holding more than the animals that show up in a wildlife survey. Neil's last piece of documented evidence, the one he considers the most significant of his entire career, and the one he held back from telling us until our final conversation, comes from September of 2021, less than a year before his retirement. He was on a routine evening patrol along a forest road that parallels the Sturgeon River, several miles upstream from where the 2017 recovery had occurred, driving slowly with his windows down the way he often did in the final hour of daylight, when he heard a vocalization from the timber to the south that he immediately associated with the handful of unexplained calls he had heard over the years and privately attributed to dogmen, a rising, guttural sound with a rough structure to it, repeated twice. He stopped the truck to listen, and roughly 90 seconds later, from a considerable distance farther south, deeper in the same drainage, he heard a second sound that he had never heard before in 26 years in that forest. Lower, heavier, a single sustained tone that he described as having almost no animal quality to it at all, more like something mechanical or resonant, the kind of sound that seemed to come from something too large to produce a normal vocalization. It lasted, by his estimate, 4 or 5 seconds, and it was not repeated. The first sound, the one he associated with dogman activity, did not call again after that second sound. Neil sat in his truck on that forest road for close to 20 minutes, engine off, waiting to see if either sound would return, and neither did. He drove home that night, by his own account, faster than the speed limit allowed, and with his headlights on high beam the entire way, and he told his wife, for the first time in their marriage, that he did not think he wanted to keep doing overnight solo patrols in that stretch of the district for the remainder of his career. He requested, and was granted, a schedule adjustment for his final year on the job that kept him closer to the more populated eastern half of his district, a request his supervisor attributed to a man easing toward retirement and never questioned further. What Neil believes he heard that evening based on everything he had documented over the previous 15 years, was a dogman vocalizing. And then, in response, something considerably larger, answering from deeper in the same drainage. He has no way to prove that interpretation. He acknowledges freely that it could have been two unrelated sounds, coincidental in timing, produced by animals with no relationship to each other at all. But he does not believe that, and after 16 years of building a case file that no institution would ever accept, built entirely on the accumulated weight of pattern rather than any single piece of definitive proof, he has learned to trust the shape the pattern makes, even when he cannot produce the kind of evidence that would satisfy a courtroom or a peer-reviewed journal. The forest is still out there, the same 900 square miles of Baraga County wilderness it has always been, still patrolled by conservation officers who inherited Neil's old district without inheriting the 16 years of private documentation that shaped how he understood it. The Dogmen reports will keep coming in the way they always have, filed under nuisance wildlife or not filed at all, dismissed by most and taken seriously by a small handful of officers who, like Neil once did, will spend years quietly building their own case files before deciding, the way Neil eventually decided, that there is nowhere to take what they have found. And somewhere in the drainages between Lance and the Sturgeon River Gorge, in the roadless country that even Neil, after 26 years, never fully finished learning, something larger and quieter than the Dogman moves through the same forest, killing efficiently and rarely, caching what it does not finish, disabling the cameras that come too close, and staying, by every piece of evidence Neil ever gathered, almost entirely out of sight. Neil does not know how many there are. 11 kill sites and 1 bipedal recovery over 16 years is not enough data to estimate a population, and he is careful never to speculate beyond what the evidence actually supports. He believes, based on the spacing and timing of the kill sites across his own district and the 2 adjoining districts where colleagues eventually shared information with him, that the animal or animals responsible maintain an enormous territory, likely spanning multiple conservation officer patrol districts, consistent with an apex predator operating at very low density, the way a large predator with few natural competitors typically does. He believes it is more common in the roadless interior of the Huron Mountains and the upper Sturgeon River drainage than anywhere closer to the towns along Keweenaw Bay, which tracks with every piece of evidence he ever collected. And he believes, though this is the piece he holds most tentatively, that whatever relationship exists between the color and the Dogman population it shares that forest with is not simple predation in the way a wolf preys on deer. It is something closer to 2 intelligent species negotiating the same limited territory, one larger and more dangerous, one more numerous and more cautious, both of them, in Neil's estimation, considerably smarter than the wildlife management system that has spent decades pretending neither one exists. Before Neil's own retirement closed the book on his active documentation, there is a second thread to this story that he insisted we include, because he believes it matters more than anything he personally recorded. In the winter of 2013, roughly 7 years into his private investigation, Neil made contact with a wildlife biologist who had spent a career studying wolf recolonization in the Upper Peninsula for a research consortium affiliated with Michigan Technological University. We are going to call her Stan, a placeholder Neil insisted on for a colleague whose real identity, if disclosed, would end a career built on a lifetime of peer-reviewed wolf research that has nothing to do with cryptids and everything to lose from association with them. Stan spent the better part of 2 decades running radio telemetry studies on Upper Peninsula wolf packs, and her professional reputation, before Neil ever approached her, was built entirely on rigorous, publishable, defensible field science. Neil did not go to Stan with a cryptid theory. He went to her, carefully, with a narrower and more defensible question. He wanted to know whether anything in her wolf telemetry data, collected across multiple packs and multiple years throughout the western Upper Peninsula, showed unexplained avoidance patterns, territory the wolves themselves seemed to steer clear of, despite otherwise suitable habitat, water access, and prey density. He framed it as a question about competitive exclusion, a legitimate area of wildlife research concerned with how predator species divide up a landscape to avoid direct conflict with each other. Stan, who had no idea what was actually motivating the question, found it interesting enough to go back through her own data. What she found and shared with Neil over the following months as their conversations grew more direct was that 2 of the wolf packs she had tracked with GPS collars between 2009 and 2012 showed a consistent, statistically notable avoidance of a roughly 40-square-mile block of the Upper Sturgeon River drainage, territory that by every measure of habitat quality, prey density, water access, and terrain should have been prime wolf habitat and, in fact, bordered territory that both packs used heavily. The wolves crossed the edges of that block occasionally, based on the collar data, but never denned within it, never held kill sites within it for more than a single feeding, and consistently altered their travel routes to skirt around it rather than through it, adding, in some cases, more than a mile of extra travel distance to avoid crossing directly through the interior of that block. Stan had noticed the pattern years earlier and filed it, in her own published research, under an unremarked footnote about localized habitat avoidance, possibly related to human disturbance or unmapped terrain features, because at the time she had no reason to suspect anything else, and no interest in speculating beyond what her data could support. When Neil eventually told her, months into their working relationship and only after he trusted her enough to risk it, that the 40-square-mile block her wolves avoided contained the majority of his own 11 documented large predator kill sites, Stan did not dismiss him. She told him, in a conversation he still describes carefully because of how much it meant to him at the time, that wolves avoiding an area that consistently, across multiple independent packs and multiple years, was not something she could explain through ordinary habitat variables, and that in her professional experience, wolves in the Upper Peninsula generally avoid only 2 things with that degree of consistency: dense human infrastructure and other wolves defending contested territory. Neither explanation applied to that block of the Sturgeon River drainage. There was no human infrastructure inside it beyond a single decommissioned logging road, and there was no rival wolf pack whose territory overlapped it, based on years of her own collar data covering every known pack in the region. Stan never went further than that in her own professional capacity. She could not, without risking a career built on defensible, publishable science, attach her name to a theory involving an unclassified apex predator, and Neil never asked her to. What she gave him, informally and off the record, was the first piece of evidence that did not come from his own eyes or his own notebook. A second, independent line of data collected by a trained scientist for entirely unrelated reasons that happened to align precisely with the territory Neil had spent years mapping through kill sites alone. For Neil, that convergence mattered enormously. It was the difference between a pattern he alone had constructed, subject to every bias and every wishful misreading a lone investigator can fall into over years of chasing something he wants to be real, and a pattern independently corroborated by data collected by someone who had no idea what she was confirming until after the fact. Stan retired from active fieldwork in 2019 and moved into a teaching position, and Neil has not spoken with her in several years, in part because both of them understood, without ever fully articulating it, that the friendship had been built around a shared secret neither of them particularly wanted to keep carrying forward. He told us he thinks about her sometimes when he drives past the Michigan Tech campus in Houghton and wonders whether she ever went back through her old data on her own, in retirement, with more time to sit with what it might have meant. There is an economic dimension to this silence that runs alongside the bureaucratic one, and it is worth naming directly because it shaped Neil's own calculations as much as any database limitation did. Baraga County's economy, like much of the western Upper Peninsula, depends heavily on outdoor recreation, deer camp traditions that draw hunters back to the same family land year after year, snowmobile tourism, along the groomed trail network that connects Lanza and Baraga to the broader Keweenaw Trail system in winter, and a steady stream of hikers and backcountry campers drawn to the Sturgeon River Gorge and the Huron Mountains, specifically because the terrain is difficult and the crowds are thin. The Keweenaw Bay Indian community operates its own tourism infrastructure along the bay, including a casino and resort that represents a significant source of tribal employment and revenue, built in part on the same regional identity as a place of pristine, safe, accessible wilderness. Neil understood, without anyone ever having to explain it to him, that a confirmed report of an unclassified apex predator responsible for documented large animal kills across a 60-mile forest corridor would not simply be a scientific curiosity to the people who run the county's chamber of commerce, the outfitters who lead guided hunts, or the tribal enterprises that depend on visitors feeling safe in the backcountry. It would be an existential threat to an economy that has few alternatives to outdoor recreation in a county with almost no other industry left since the decline of copper mining a century ago. That calculation sat alongside every other reason. Neil kept his notebook private, not as the primary reason, but as one more layer of the same structural pressure that kept Kurt quiet about the Oregon timber sale and kept the security contractors quiet about the Umatilla depot footage. Small economies, built on the promise of safe, knowable wilderness, have almost no capacity to absorb evidence that the wilderness is not entirely knowable after all. And the people who might otherwise report what they have seen understand that cost as clearly as anyone. The historical layer beneath all of this, the piece that gives the Colors territory a depth extending back well before any conservation officer's career, connects to documented history of the Keweenaw Bay Indian community and the broader network of Ojibwe bands across the Lake Superior Basin, whose traditional territory encompassed the entirety of what is now Baraga County long before the process. Treaty of La Pointe in 1842 ceded most of the Upper Peninsula's mineral rights to the United States, and long before the subsequent 1854 Treaty of La Pointe established the reservation boundaries that define the Keweenaw Bay Indian community's land base today. The treaty negotiations of that period, extensively documented in federal records and in the tribal community's own historical accounts, involved Ojibwe leaders who were explicit in council records preserved from the period about which specific stretches of the interior forest they wished to retain hunting and gathering rights to under treaty provisions, rights that persist today, and that the Keweenaw Bay Indian community continues to exercise and defend through its own Natural Resources Department. Historical accounts from missionaries and Indian agents stationed in the region during the mid-1800s, preserved in archival collections at Michigan Technological University and in Michigan State Historical Records, describe Ojibwe guides who were consistently reluctant to lead surveying parties and mining prospectors into certain stretches of the interior uplands, offering vague or evasive explanations that period observers, operating from within their own cultural framework, generally attributed to superstition or simple unfamiliarity with the terrain, without ever seriously entertaining the possibility that the guides possessed specific, practical knowledge about the landscape that the surveying parties did not. This is a pattern Linda Godfrey has documented repeatedly across her 3 decades of Great Lakes Dogman research. The tendency of indigenous communities with generations of accumulated knowledge about specific landscapes to respond to outside inquiry, not with open storytelling, but with careful, bounded acknowledgement, followed by a firm return to privacy, a pattern entirely distinct from either enthusiastic confirmation or flat denial. It is the pattern Owen described to Neil in that conversation in Scanny in 2011, and it is the same pattern on the tribal cultural resources, contacts and other Dogmen accounts across the region have consistently displayed when approached by outside researchers. The knowledge exists. It is neither offered freely to outsiders nor performed for their benefit. It sits, protected, within a framework of relationship to the land that predates the state of Michigan by thousands of years, and that has no particular interest in accommodating a conservation officer's incident report form or a cryptid researcher's documentary. Neil's case connects to 2 additional threads worth walking through in detail, because together they suggest that what he documented in Baraga County is not an isolated regional anomaly, but part of a broader, poorly understood pattern across Dogman territory generally, one that conventional Dogman research has occasionally brushed against without ever fully naming. Before turning to those 2 threads, it is worth walking back through the 2015 bear kill site in more detail than Neil offered in his first account, because it is the single piece of physical evidence he returns to most often when trying to explain, to himself, as much as to anyone else, why he eventually stopped believing the color's behavior could be explained through ordinary predator instinct alone. The site sat along a tributary. Neil has asked us not to name more specifically than the Sturgeon River drainage generally, reached by a 2-track that had not been graded in years, and then close to a mile on foot through second-growth aspen and alder, thick enough to require pushing through with both arms raised to protect his face. He remembers the day clearly because it was unseasonably warm for October, warm enough that he had sweated through his uniform shirt by the time he reached the clearing, and because the black bear itself, before its death, had been one he recognized. Baraga County conservation officers maintain informal familiarity with the larger, more visible bears in their districts, individuals distinguished by ear tag numbers from earlier DNR research trapping, by scars, by patterns of movement documented over repeated encounters, and this particular bear, a mature male Neil estimated at close to 500 pounds, had worn a research ear tag from a bait station study 3 years earlier, and had been, in Neil's own words, about as close to a known quantity as an Upper Peninsula black bear gets. Finding that specific animal dead, at the top of its own local food chain, killed with the same single catastrophic application of force Neil had by then documented at 4 other sites, was unsettling on its own. What made the 2015 site different was the arrangement he found roughly 30 yards away, on the far side of a fallen white pine that had come down in a windstorm years earlier and lay half submerged in the tributary's slow current. Neil approached that log expecting, at most, additional scavenging sign, coyote or raven activity drawn to the kill after the fact. What he found instead was a row of the bear's own limb bones, 4 of them, cleaned almost entirely of tissue in a way that a single day or even several days of natural scavenging in October weather would not typically produce, laid across the top of the log in a rough line, spaced with what looked, even to Neil standing there trying hard not to read intention into something he understood he might be misinterpreting, like deliberate placement rather than the scattered debris field a scavenging animal leaves behind. He photographed the arrangement from multiple angles before touching anything, then sat on a nearby stump for close to 20 minutes, simply looking at it, turning over every alternative explanation his training could produce, and finding none of them adequate. He has never found an adequate one since. He does not claim to understand what the arrangement meant, whether it reflected some kind of deliberate display, a byproduct of feeding behavior no biologist has ever documented in any known predator, or something else entirely outside any category his career had prepared him to interpret. What he will say, flatly, every time this comes up, is that nothing officially recognized in the state of Michigan behaves this way, and that whatever produced that arrangement understood the difference between simply consuming a kill and doing something with the remains afterward that served a purpose beyond feeding. The first thread comes from an account that surfaced independently, years before Neil ever went public, through a completely separate research channel focused on Wisconsin's Chickamauga-Nicolet National Forest. A conservation warden working for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, whose account was passed to a small regional cryptid research group in the early 2010s under conditions of strict anonymity that this channel has independently verified were maintained, described a strikingly similar pattern across a multi-year period in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Large ungulate kill sites, primarily elk and occasionally deer, showing catastrophic single-injury mortality, inconsistent with wolf or coyote predation. A single set of anomalous 14 to 16-inch tracks recovered near 2 of the kill sites, described in terms nearly identical to what Neil documented in Baraga County, generally humanoid in structural placement, but splayed and clawed in a way no known species produces. And, most strikingly, a second-hand account relayed to that warden by an older colleague nearing retirement, describing a decades-earlier discovery of partial remains in a remote section of the forest that the older warden had always privately believed belonged to a dogman killed by something else, and that he had never reported through any official channel for reasons that, when finally explained to his younger colleague near the end of his own career, matched almost exactly the institutional and professional calculus Neil described to us about his own decision to keep his findings private. Two separate law enforcement officers in two separate states, operating decades apart and with no known contact or awareness of each other's work, independently arrived at the same conclusion through the same category of physical evidence: a pattern of catastrophic large animal kills, inconsistent with any documented predator, associated tracks inconsistent with any known species, and, in each case, a single instance of apparent bipedal remains that each officer privately attributed to a dogman killed by something larger. Neither officer has ever met the other. Neither was aware, until this channel began comparing notes across separate research threads, that a parallel account existed in a different state entirely. The consistency between these two independent accounts, collected years apart through entirely separate research relationships, is difficult to explain as coincidence and equally difficult to dismiss as fabrication, given that fabrication would require two career law enforcement officers in two different states to have independently invented an identical and highly specific pattern of evidence without any contact or shared source between them. It is worth pausing here to say plainly what Neil and Roger's combined case file does and does not do to the broader body of Dogman research. This channel and others have spent years compiling. It does not diminish any previous account. A witness who described a large, upright, canine-headed animal moving through timber, investigating a camp, or standing at a tree line watching a truck, was almost certainly describing exactly what they believed they were describing, and nothing in Neil's or Roger's findings suggests otherwise. What their combined evidence does is add a layer beneath the dogman that almost no prior research has considered, an apex predator that the dogman itself may share a landscape with, uneasily, the same way wolves in the Upper Peninsula share range with black bears, competing for some resources, avoiding direct conflict where possible, and occasionally losing that avoidance calculation in ways that leave physical evidence behind for someone trained enough to recognize it. If that layered hierarchy exists in the Huron Mountains and the Sturgeon River country, there is no obvious reason to assume it exists nowhere else. And the scattered second-hand accounts from Wisconsin, filtered through separate research networks with no knowledge of Neil's or Roger's work, suggest at minimum that the question deserves more attention than it has received. The second thread comes from within the Dogman research community itself, and specifically from a pattern that Linda Godfrey noted, almost in passing, in interviews conducted over the years but never developed into a dedicated line of inquiry, because her research has always focused primarily on documenting Dogman sightings themselves, rather than investigating what might prey upon them. In several of her case files, spanning multiple decades and multiple states, witnesses who reported Dogman sightings also mentioned, sometimes unprompted and sometimes only when pressed for additional detail, a second and distinct auditory phenomenon associated with the same general area, a deeper, less frequent, more unsettling vocalization that witnesses consistently distinguished from whatever sound they attributed to the dogman itself. Godfrey's published work references this secondary phenomenon only briefly, generally treating it as a variant dogman vocalization rather than evidence of a distinct second animal, in part because her research methodology, built around cataloging dogman sightings specifically, was never oriented toward investigating whether a separate apex predator might share the same territory. Re-examined through the lens of what Neil documented in Baraga County, those secondary vocalization reports take on a different weight, suggesting that witnesses across multiple states and multiple decades may have been unknowingly documenting encounters with two distinct animals, one of which researchers have spent 30 years cataloging in detail, and one of which has remained almost entirely unrecognized because nobody was specifically looking for it. Neil's account also intersects meaningfully with a specific and well-documented piece of regional history that predates his own career by well over a century, and that he only connected to his own findings relatively late. After a conversation with a Michigan Technological University archivist who had helped him research the treaty-era survey records mentioned earlier, copper mining surveys and exploration parties, working the interior of Baraga County and the adjoining Ontonagon County throughout the 1850s and 1860s, during the peak of the Keweenaw copper rush, generated an unusually high volume of documented cases involving lost or missing prospectors and survey crew members in the interior uplands, a rate that period mining company records and newspaper accounts from Houghton and Lanza attributed, at the time, to the genuinely brutal difficulty of the terrain, the density of the old-growth forest, and the primitive state of period mapping. Most of these cases were resolved through straightforward explanations: exposure, injury, or simple disorientation in country that remains difficult to navigate even today. A smaller number were never resolved at all. Prospectors and survey assistants who walked into the interior and were never found, their disappearances recorded in company ledgers and period newspapers with a matter-of-fact brevity typical of an era when frontier deaths were common enough not to warrant extensive investigation. The archivist Neil eventually worked with a Michigan Technological University researcher specializing in copper country labor and settlement history, walked him through company ledgers from at least 4 mining and survey operations active in the Baraga and Ontonagon County interior between 1850 and 1870, records preserved today in the university's archives and available, in redacted form respecting family privacy, to researchers who request access. Those ledgers document a pattern familiar to anyone who has studied frontier-era mining history: injuries from rockfall and equipment failure, deaths from exposure during the brutal Upper Peninsula winters, and a smaller category, the ledgers themselves labeled, in the terse language typical of the period, as lost in the interior, a designation applied to prospectors, survey chainmen, and occasionally entire small parties who walked into the uncharted uplands south of the bay and were never accounted for again, their fate left unresolved in the historical record because no search party of the period had the resources or the incentive to spend weeks combing terrain that difficult for men whose employers had already written off the exploration claim as unprofitable. The archivist's own comparative analysis, conducted for an unrelated academic project years before Neil ever approached her, had already noted that the rate of lost in the interior designations clustered unusually tightly around the same general geography that would, more than a century and a half later, correspond to Neil's own kill site documentation and Stan's wolf avoidance data, a clustering she had originally attributed to the simple fact that the terrain in that specific area was more difficult and more poorly mapped than surrounding country. A perfectly reasonable explanation on its own terms that Neil's findings do not disprove so much as sit alongside, uncomfortably, as one more layer in a pattern that keeps returning to the same 60-mile corridor no matter which historical or scientific lens is used to examine it. Neil does not claim, and this account does not claim on his behalf, that any specific historical disappearance can be attributed to the animal he spent 16 years documenting. The historical record from that period is too thin, too shaped by the assumptions and limitations of 19th century record-keeping to support that kind of specific claim. And Neil was emphatic, in every conversation we had with him, that he did not want this story to overstate what the evidence can actually support. What he will say is that the rate of unresolved disappearance in that specific stretch of interior Baraga and Ontonagon County terrain during the mining survey era was notably higher than in comparable terrain elsewhere in the copper country, according to the archivist's own comparative research, and that the geographic center of that historical pattern overlaps substantially with the 40-square-mile block of the Upper Sturgeon River drainage that both his own kill site documentation and Stan's independent wolf telemetry data identified as anomalous. He finds that overlap significant. He does not claim it as proof. He describes it carefully as one more data point in a pattern that has been accumulating from multiple independent directions for over a century. The final piece of Neil's account, and the one he was most reluctant to share, concerns what happened to the 2017 recovery site itself. In the years after he and Warren made the decision to leave the remains where they found them, Neil returned to that location exactly once, in the fall of 2019, driven by a combination of professional obligation, since the site technically remained within his patrol district, and he felt an unresolved responsibility to at least confirm nothing had changed in a way that required official attention, and a private need to see the clearing again before too much more time passed. He found almost nothing, The remains themselves had, by that point, been almost entirely reclaimed by the forest floor, consistent with 2 years of decomposition and scavenging in a wet Upper Peninsula climate, and Neil found only a handful of bone fragments too degraded to photograph meaningfully. But he found something else, roughly 60 yards from the original site, that he had not expected and that he has thought about regularly in the years since. A single tree, a mature yellow birch close to 2 feet in diameter, bore a set of deep vertical claw marks running from approximately 5 feet off the ground to just over 8 feet, far higher than any black bear in the region could reach, and spaced in groups of 4, with a width between individual gouges, that Neil, drawing on his own years of documenting the color's kill sites, immediately associated with the same animal responsible for everything else he had spent 16 years cataloging. He stood in front of that tree for a long time, he told us, turning over what it might mean that the animal, or something like it, had returned to the specific site of what he believed was a dogman's death 2 years after the fact, marking a tree within sight of where the remains had lain. He does not know whether it was returning to reassert territorial claim over ground where it had made a significant kill, whether the marking was unrelated and simply reflected the tree's position within routine territorial patrol behavior that had nothing to do with the 2017 recovery at all, or whether it meant something else entirely that sits outside anything his training or his years of documentation had prepared him to interpret. What he does know is that he has not been back to that clearing since, and that the memory of standing in front of that marked tree, alone, 60 yards from where he once knelt over the remains of what he believes was a dogman, is the single image from his entire 26-year career that he says he cannot fully set down. When Neil finally walked us through the 2006 moose kill a second time, months into our conversations and after he had already described it once in the flat, procedural language of an incident report, the details that surfaced on that second pass were different in kind from anything in his first account. He was not describing the wound pattern anymore. He was describing what it felt like to be alone in that clearing with his notebook in his hand, 11 miles from the nearest paved road, radio traffic silent, the light starting to fail through the canopy, and the slow, physical realization that whatever had done this to 900 pounds of living animal had not needed a pack to do it, had not needed hours, had done it with what looked, even to a man who had spent a decade around violent death in the woods, like almost no effort at all. He told us his hands were unsteady enough, taking his measurements, that he had to stop twice and reset the tape. He told us that when he finally heard Warren's truck coming up the 2-track behind him, the relief that went through his body was disproportionate to anything he had felt responding to an armed poacher call, and that it took him years to understand why. An armed poacher is a threat he had trained for. This was not the audio component of Neil's case, something he mentioned only in passing during our earliest conversations and only described in full detail much later, deserves its own accounting, because it is the piece of evidence that most directly ties his findings to the broader pattern this channel has documented in other states. In the spring of 2010, 4 years after the moose kill and 7 years before the creek bottom recovery, Neil began carrying a small handheld voice recorder on overnight patrols, not with any specific intention of capturing wildlife sound, but out of a general habit of documenting anything unusual he encountered in the field, the same instinct that had led him to start his private notebook in the first place. Over the following 12 years, he captured, in fragments, portions of 9 separate vocalization events that he could not attribute to any known Michigan species, most of them brief, most of them degraded by wind noise or distance. Several of them, in his own assessment, almost certainly attributable in part to the more familiar dogman vocalizations that hunters and hikers throughout the region have described for decades. A rising, structured call with a rough, throaty quality that Neil came to recognize well enough over the years to distinguish from owls, from coyotes, and from every other nocturnal sound the forest routinely produces. 2 of the 9 recordings are different from the rest, and it is these 2 that Neil considers the most significant evidence in his entire file. More significant even than the photographs from the creek bottom recovery, because unlike a static image, a sound captures behavior in real time. And what these 2 recordings capture, in Neil's interpretation, is an exchange, The first, recorded in October of 2014 along a ridge above the Sturgeon River Gorge, begins with what Neil identifies as a typical Dogman call, two rising phrases separated by several seconds of silence, the kind of vocalization he had captured in cleaner form on at least 3 other occasions. Roughly 90 seconds after the second phrase, a third sound enters the recording, lower in pitch than anything else on any of Neil's tapes, sustained for what audio analysis he eventually commissioned through a contact willing to examine the file without being told anything about its origin. Beyond that, it was recorded in the Upper Peninsula, measured at just under 5 seconds, with almost none of the harmonic structure typical of mammalian vocalization, a sound the analyst described, in a brief written assessment Neil still has in his files, as closer to a resonant tone than a call, difficult to attribute confidently to any species without a reference sample, but inconsistent with wind, water, or any mechanical source Neil could identify near the recording location. After that third sound, the recording captures nothing further, no response from whatever produced the first 2 phrases. Silence. For the remaining 11 minutes, Neil left the recorder running before he finally shut it off and drove home. The second recording, captured in September of 2021, the same evening Neil described earlier, hearing the sounds directly with his own ears before he ever thought to check whether his recorder, sitting on the truck's dashboard out of habit, had captured anything at all. Matches his memory of the encounter closely enough that Neil considers it the single strongest piece of corroborating evidence in his entire 16-year file. The recorder captured the same 2-phrase rising call, followed roughly 90 seconds later by the same low, sustained tone, this time slightly longer, closer to 6 seconds by the analyst's measurement, and this time followed, after a gap of nearly 4 minutes of near-total silence, by a third and final sound that neither of Neil's other recordings contain. A short, rapid sequence of lower calls, 3 in quick succession, that Neil, going purely on the pattern rather than any confirmed species identification, has come to interpret as a retreat call, the kind of hurried, repeated vocalization a smaller and more vulnerable animal might produce while moving quickly away from something considerably more dangerous. Neil is careful, every time this comes up, to describe his own interpretation of these recordings as exactly that, an interpretation built by a trained observer with 16 years of contextual field experience, but without the benefit of controlled study, spectrographic reference libraries for an unclassified species, or any of the tools a genuine bioacoustics research program would bring to the question. He does not claim the recordings prove a predator-prey relationship between 2 cryptid species. He claims only that the pattern across both recordings, a rising call, a long silence, a single lower and heavier tone, and then either total silence or a rapid retreat sequence, is internally consistent, repeated on 2 separate occasions, 7 years apart, in 2 different locations within his patrol district, and matches, in its broad structure if not its specific acoustic detail, exactly what a biologist would expect to hear if a smaller, vocal, territorial animal encountered a larger, quieter, and more dangerous one, and chose retreat over confrontation. There is a third officer whose account belongs in this record, and Neil brought us to him only after months of his own deliberation, because unlike Warren and unlike Stan, this man never worked directly alongside Neil, and came to his own conclusions independently, years earlier, in a different patrol district entirely. We are going to call him Roger. Roger spent 31 years as a Michigan DNR conservation officer, the majority of them assigned to a district in neighboring Marquette County that borders Neil's old territory along a shared stretch of the Ottawa National Forest boundary near the Huron Mountain Club's private holdings. Roger retired in 2015, 2 years before the creek bottom recovery that convinced Neil beyond doubt, and he had never heard of Neil's private notebook until a mutual acquaintance in the retired conservation officer community, a small and tightly knit group that gathers informally every few years for a reunion dinner in Marquette, put the two of them in touch in the spring of 2023. After Neil had already retired and had begun, quietly, testing whether anyone else in the department's institutional memory carried anything similar, Roger's account begins in 1994, more than a decade before Neil's own moose kill in the Sturgeon River country. In terrain along the upper reaches of the Yellow Dog River drainage, a watershed that flows north out of the Huron Mountains through some of the most remote and least visited forest in the entire Upper Peninsula, before emptying into Lake Superior west of Big Bay. The Yellow Dog Plains, an unusual stretch of open barrens and jack pine forest, sitting atop the same volcanic bedrock that runs through the Huron Mountains into Baraga County, had long carried a local reputation among Marquette County hunters as unproductive ground, thin on deer, difficult to access, and generally avoided in favor of the richer hardwood ridges closer to the Marquette city limits. Roger, newly assigned to the district and eager to establish his own understanding of terrain his more senior colleagues considered marginal, spent considerable time in his first years, learning exactly why the plains carried that reputation, and what he found did not match the explanation his colleagues had always given him. In October of 1994, responding to a report from a grouse hunter who had come across what he described as an unusually large and disturbing animal carcass along an old two-track bisecting the plains, Roger drove out to a site roughly 4 miles from the nearest maintained road and found the remains of an adult black bear, an animal that field indicators, primarily dentition wear later examined by a wildlife biologist colleague, suggested was somewhere between 12 and 15 years old, an unusually mature individual for the region, and, at an estimated weight approaching 400 pounds, based on the remaining skeletal frame, one of the largest bears Roger had encountered in his young career. The bear's skull showed a single massive fracture at the base, and its spine had been separated with a force that Roger, 29 years old at the time and only 3 years into his career, initially assumed must indicate some kind of accidental death, a fall from the steep bedrock outcrops that punctuate the plains, before a closer examination ruled that explanation out entirely. There was no terrain feature near the kill site consistent with a fatal fall. The bear had died where it lay, or very close to it, from a single application of force that Roger, even with limited experience at the time, understood immediately did not match anything in his academy training on predator identification. Roger did what a young officer trained to trust institutional knowledge does. He brought his findings to his district supervisor, a conservation officer with over 20 years in the Marquette County Post, expecting either an explanation or an investigation. What he got instead was a conversation that reshaped how he approached the rest of his career. His supervisor looked at the photographs, looked at Roger's measurements, and told him, in language Roger has repeated to us almost verbatim, because it stayed with him for 3 decades, that the Yellow Dog Plains had always had strange kills, that officers going back to before either of them had been born had documented similar finds and never been able to explain them, and that the department's unofficial position, passed down the same way Owen had passed his caution down to Neil, was to document what could be documented, close the file under cause undetermined, and never push further than that, because pushing further had, in at least one case, the supervisor was willing to describe only in the vaguest terms, cost a predecessor his standing within the department entirely. That predecessor, Roger eventually learned over years of careful, patient inquiry among retired officers at exactly the kind of informal reunion gatherings where he would later meet Neil, was a conservation officer who had worked the Yellow Dog District in the 1970s and had, according to 2 separate second-hand accounts Roger pieced together decades apart, attempted to formally document a pattern of unexplained large predator kills through internal department channels, requesting laboratory analysis of tissue and track samples from a state forensics contact, rather than simply filing the ambiguous cause undetermined paperwork his colleagues used. The request, according to both accounts, was quietly declined. The officer was informally counseled about maintaining professional credibility, and within 2 years he had transferred out of wildlife enforcement entirely into a desk position in Lansing, a career trajectory that, in a department where officers fight hard to stay in the field districts they love, reads as a quiet demotion regardless of how it was formally described on paper. Roger never learned that officer's name. He has spent enough of his own career protecting Neil's identity and his own to understand exactly why that information never survived in any form more permanent than a story told carefully, once, at a retirement dinner, by men who had themselves been told it carefully, once, by the generation before them. Over the following 2 decades, Roger documented, independently of anything happening in Neil's district to the south, 7 additional kill sites across the Yellow Dog Plains and the adjoining stretch of the Huron Mountains uplands that borders the Huron Mountain Club's private land, a 19th-century hunting and conservation club whose membership has included prominent Michigan and national figures for over a century, and whose roughly 22,000 acres of private old-growth forest, managed with minimal human disturbance for generations, represents some of the most undisturbed habitat remaining anywhere in the eastern United States. Roger's kill sites showed the identical signature Neil would later document to the south: single catastrophic neck or skull trauma, no feeding pattern consistent with wolves or coyotes working a carcass communally. Carcasses, in 4 of the 7 cases, relocated substantial distances from where the animal appeared to have initially been taken down, moved by what Roger, like Neil, concluded had to be a single animal capable of transporting several hundred pounds of dead weight through dense, uneven terrain without the assistance of any pack. The Yellow Dog Plains themselves deserve a closer look, because the terrain explains a great deal about why the pattern concentrated there specifically rather than spreading evenly across Roger's entire patrol district. The plains sit atop a band of exposed volcanic bedrock, part of the same mid-continent rift geology that produced the copper deposits farther north, and the thin, acidic soil that results supports a distinctive mix of jack pine barrens, open rock outcrops, and scattered wetland pockets, unlike anything in the surrounding hardwood forest. That patchwork terrain creates unusually good visibility in some stretches and near total concealment in others, sight lines that open across a barren rock face for 100 yards and then close instantly into dense jack pine regrowth, thick enough to stop a person 20 feet in. It is exactly the kind of terrain a territorial predator with a strong incentive to avoid detection would favor, offering both the elevated vantage points needed to monitor approaching threats from a distance and the immediate cover needed to disappear the moment that monitoring suggested retreat was the better option. Roger came to understand the plains' particular value to whatever was using them only gradually. Over years of walking the same rock outcrops and jack pine stands on his own patrol rounds, developing the same intimate, ground-level fluency with the terrain that Neil would later develop with the Sturgeon River country to the south, the kind of knowledge that cannot be gained from a topographic map and that neither man has ever been able to fully translate for anyone who has not walked that specific ground themselves. Roger's most significant find came in the summer of 2003, 9 years into his own private documentation and 3 years before Neil's own moose kill would set his parallel investigation in motion to the south. Responding to a report of unusual animal sounds from a backcountry camper on Huron Mountain Club land, adjacent to but not within the club's boundary, Roger walked a drainage that fed into the Yellow Dog River and found, in a small clearing surrounded by old-growth hemlock, a set of tracks preserved in soft ground near a spring seep that he was able to cast in plaster before the impressions degraded. The tracks, roughly 15 inches long, showed the same generally humanoid heel and forefoot structure that Neil would later document in Baraga County, with a splayed, clawed front section that matched no species Roger could identify from any field guide or any conversation with the wildlife biologists he occasionally consulted informally, always framing his questions the way Neil later learned to do independently, in terms narrow enough not to invite the follow-up questions that would have exposed what he was actually investigating. Roger's private investigation, in its early years, proceeded with almost none of the institutional cover Neil would later have as a more senior officer. As a young conservation officer still building his reputation within the department, Roger could not afford to be seen spending department time or department resources chasing what his supervisor had already, in that first conversation, framed as an unofficial and career-limiting line of inquiry. He conducted almost all of his early documentation on personal time, using his own truck and his own camera equipment, the same pattern Russ would later follow independently in the Manistee National Forest to the south. a pattern that recurs often enough across these accounts that it stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like the only viable path available to anyone inside an institution with no category for what they are finding. Roger kept those casts. He showed them to us in a photograph he shared through Neil after weeks of the two of them discussing whether it was safe to do so. Still stored in a box in his garage in Marquette, nearly 2 decades later, alongside a second, smaller set of casts he made in 2008 from a different site closer to the club boundary. Tracks that showed a more conventional canine structure, 4-toed, with claw marks consistent in general shape with the second-hand Dogman descriptions he had been hearing from hunters and hikers throughout his entire career. Roger, independently of Neil and years before the two men ever spoke, had reached the identical conclusion. 2 distinct unclassified animals sharing the same stretch of the Huron Mountains uplands. One larger and responsible for the catastrophic large animal kills. One smaller, more frequently glimpsed, and matching the broader regional Dogman profile that Linda Godfrey and other researchers had been cataloging from witness reports across the Great Lakes for decades. When Neil and Roger finally spoke, in the spring of 2023, and laid their 2 independent case files side by side across Roger's kitchen table in Marquette, the overlap was immediate and, according to both men, deeply unsettling in a way that neither had anticipated. 2 officers, working 2 adjoining districts, separated by roughly 40 miles of shared forest boundary, had each spent between 16 and 20 years privately documenting the identical pattern, without either one ever knowing the other existed, without ever comparing notes, without any institutional mechanism that could have connected their findings, even if either man had wanted it connected. The Michigan DNR's own incident reporting system, structured around individual patrol districts and cause undetermined classifications that generate no cross-district pattern analysis, had effectively guaranteed that 2 independent, decades-long investigations into the same phenomenon could run in parallel for the better part of 30 years without either investigator knowing the other's work existed. That realization is, in Neil's own assessment, the single most damning piece of evidence for how thoroughly the institutional structure of Michigan wildlife management has failed to account for what he and Roger together documented. It is not that anyone actively suppressed either man's findings, in the sense of a deliberate decision made by a specific person to bury specific evidence. It is that the system was never built with a mechanism capable of connecting 2 conservation officers in adjoining districts, each independently documenting a pattern spanning the same shared forest, because the system has no category for the pattern itself. Cause undetermined kill reports from Marquette County and cause undetermined kill reports from Baraga County are filed, archived, and forgotten separately by design, because the database architecture underlying Michigan's wildlife incident tracking was built around individual district accountability rather than statewide pattern recognition for anything outside the 6 recognized large carnivore species. 2 officers who together accumulated 18 documented kill sites and 2 partial bipedal recoveries across nearly 3 decades of overlapping tenure never had a single institutional prompt, in all that time, to compare notes with each other. Roger's account added something else to the record that Neil's own investigation, focused as it was on his own patrol district, had never fully developed. A clearer picture of how the pattern related to the Huron Mountain Club's private land specifically. The club's 22,000 acres, largely closed to public access and managed for generations, with an explicit conservation ethic that has kept much of it in a condition closer to pre-settlement old-growth forest than almost anywhere else in the region, represents, in Roger's assessment, the most likely core territory for whatever animal or animals were responsible for the pattern he and Neil documented. The club's own gamekeepers and land managers, a small full-time staff responsible for monitoring wildlife and maintaining the property's famously restrictive access policies, have, according to 2 separate conversations Roger had over the years with club employees he considered trustworthy enough to ask carefully framed questions, their own long-standing informal awareness of unusual large predator activity within the property boundary, awareness that, like everything else in this account, has never been formalized into any public document any published wildlife survey, or any statement the club has ever made to outside researchers, journalists, or state wildlife agencies. The club, a private entity with no obligation to report anything to the DNR beyond what state hunting regulations require on land where hunting occurs at all, has functioned for over a century as an accidental sanctuary, not just for the old-growth forest itself, but, Roger believes, for whatever has been living within it. That combination, prime undisturbed habitat locked behind a century of private ownership and restrictive access, bordered on multiple sides by the roadless interior of the Ottawa National Forest and the Huron Mountains wilderness, extending south into the Sturgeon River drainage that Neil spent his career patrolling, describes a corridor of largely unbroken, minimally disturbed forest, running roughly 60 miles from the Yellow Dog Plains, south through the Huron Mountains, and into the Upper Sturgeon River country, encompassing some of the most remote and least accessible terrain in the entire Upper Peninsula. It is, in Roger's words, exactly the kind of landscape a genuinely rare apex predator, operating at very low population density, the way large predators with minimal competition typically do, would need to sustain a viable population across multiple generations without ever coming into regular contact with the kind of human presence that would force a confrontation or generate the sustained documentation that might eventually force institutional acknowledgement. Roger's own retirement in 2015 followed a pattern that will, by now, feel familiar. He stopped hunting the Yellow Dog Plains and the surrounding uplands entirely in his final working years, shifting his own recreational hunting to public land far to the east, closer to Marquette, terrain he had walked 100 times and trusted completely. His wife, whom Roger described to us in terms almost identical to how Neil's wife described her own husband's withdrawal, noticed the change without ever being told the full reason until years into their marriage, and told Roger, when he finally explained it to her in full sometime after his own retirement, that she had always assumed something specific had happened to him on the job that he simply did not want to discuss, some violent confrontation or difficult death investigation of the kind that conservation officers occasionally carry home from a career spent working alone in remote country. The truth, when he finally told her, was both stranger and, in her own words to Roger, somehow easier to sit with than the vague dread she had lived alongside for years without a name for it. She told him she would rather know the specific, impossible thing than keep wondering about the shapeless one. Neither man has any interest in convincing skeptics, and both told us, separately, that they expect most people who hear this account to dismiss it the same way most of their own former colleagues would dismiss it if either man ever spoke openly within the department. That expectation does not trouble either of them the way it once might have. 30 combined years of fieldwork taught both men that the woods do not require belief to keep functioning exactly as they always have, with or without an audience, with or without a name for everything moving through them. What they want instead, if they want anything from telling this story at all, is simply for the record to exist somewhere outside their own two heads, so that whatever comes after them, another warden, another biologist, another quiet observer, willing to spend a decade of unpaid weekends walking the same drainage over and over until the pattern finally makes itself known, has somewhere to start. Both men have talked, more than once, about what it would take for either of them to change that calculation. Neil says the only thing that would move him is a genuine, quiet approach from someone with real scientific standing and no interest in publicity. A wildlife biologist or a university researcher willing to walk the ground first and ask questions second, the same kind of person Rust described wanting in the Manistee. Roger says he is less certain even that would be enough anymore. He has watched too many other fields of American life get flattened by attention that arrives faster than anyone can manage it, and he does not trust any modern institution, university or otherwise, to keep something this fragile contained once it is officially acknowledged to exist. That disagreement between the two men, small as it is one of the only points of real friction in an otherwise close friendship built on total agreement about almost everything else they spent their careers documenting, and both say they expect to keep having versions of that same argument for as long as they keep meeting for coffee in Marquette. Two retired wardens, comparing notes on a forest, neither of them will ever stop watching, even now. even from a distance, even from the safety of a kitchen table, 40 miles from the nearest tree line. Either man still trusts enough to walk alone after dark. Neil put it more simply. The last time we spoke, he said he was not looking for anyone to believe him. He said he had spent his whole career being believed, by his supervisors, by the hunters who trusted his judgment, by his own family, and that the belief had never once mattered as much as the ground itself did, the actual weight of the forest under his boots on a given morning. What he wanted, in the end, was only for someone else to keep walking it carefully, the way he had, long after he no longer could. Roger and Neil now speak regularly, the first sustained professional and personal relationship either man has had since retirement, built around a shared understanding of what they each spent their careers documenting, and both men described that relationship, cautiously, as one of the only genuine reliefs either of them has found in the years since they stopped actively working the districts that shaped their understanding of what actually lives in the Huron Mountains and the country south of them. Neither man expects that relief to extend much further. They have discussed, at length, whether to approach a third retired officer, a woman who worked a district bordering Rogers to the west, and who both men suspect, based on comments she made at a retirement gathering several years ago that neither of them thought much of at the time, may have her own version of the same case file. They have not yet approached her. Neil told us that after everything it cost him personally to finally share his own notebook with this channel, he understands now exactly how much he is asking of anyone he might bring into this circle, and he wants to be certain, before he asks, that he is doing it for her benefit and not simply because the isolation has become easier to bear with company than it ever was alone. The territorial hierarchy Neil and Roger have pieced together, combining nearly 3 decades of overlapping and previously unconnected documentation across 2 adjoining patrol districts, suggests something considerably larger in scope than either man originally believed when each was working in isolation. 18 documented large animal kill sites, 2 partial bipedal recoveries, 1 independently corroborating wolf telemetry dataset, and 2 separate sets of anomalous track castings, spanning a corridor of roughly 60 miles of largely unbroken forest, running from the Yellow Dog Plains through the Huron Mountains and into the Sturgeon River drainage. It is the most extensive body of physical evidence either man has ever heard described for anything resembling an apex predator preying on dogman populations anywhere in the Great Lakes region, and it exists entirely outside any institutional record, held instead in 2 garages, 2 private notebooks, and a small, careful circle of retired wardens who trust each other enough to keep comparing notes on something the state of Michigan has never once officially acknowledged might exist. What both men return to, in every conversation we had with them, is not fear, exactly, though both acknowledge the fear was real and, for each of them, reshaped how they spent the final years of careers they had once expected to end very differently. What they return to is something closer to grief, for a version of the woods they thought they understood completely and now understand they never did, and for the version of themselves, competent, thorough, trusted by their colleagues to read a landscape correctly, that neither man fully recognizes in the retirement they are living now. Marked as it is by locked doors, avoided drainages, and a friendship built on the one subject, neither of them can discuss with anyone else who was not there. Among the handful of colleagues who ever came close to understanding what he had spent 16 years documenting, as one of the most careful and reliable conservation officers to work that district in a generation, he kept that reputation by keeping his notebook private. He is telling this story now, on the condition that his name and Warren's name both stay changed, and that neither of us describe the exact drainage where the 2017 recovery took place, because he believes, even now, even in retirement, that the last thing that stretch of forest needs is public attention. He said, in our final conversation, that he spent 26 years protecting that landscape from the people who wanted to take too much from it, poachers, illegal loggers, careless recreational users, and that the last thing he intends to do, on his way out the door, is expose the one thing living in it that has never once, in his own words, asked anything of him beyond being left alone. Roger's own closest encounter, The one experience in his 31-year career that he says finally erased any lingering doubt he had been protecting for himself happened in November of 2011, 8 years after the track casting at the Spring Seep, and 8 years before he would ever compare notes with Neil. He was on a late afternoon patrol along the boundary road that separates public Ottawa National Forest land from the Huron Mountain Club property, checking hunting licenses during the peak of firearm deer season, when he noticed an unusual stillness settle over a stretch of mixed hardwood forest he had driven past hundreds of times without incident. Deer season in the Upper Peninsula typically means a forest full of noise, distant rifle shots, the crack of dry leaves under boots, ravens gathering over gut piles left by successful hunters. Roger described the quarter-mile of road he was driving that afternoon as suddenly and completely empty of all of it. A silence that felt less like absence and more like something actively holding its breath. He slowed the truck without entirely deciding to. About 60 yards off the road, where the boundary fence line met a stand of old hemlock, still holding thick shadow, even in the mid-afternoon light, something was standing motionless at the edge of the trees. Roger's first assumption, the same assumption every experienced woodsman reaches for first, was a hunter. Someone who had crossed onto the private club land by mistake, standing still, the way a person freezes when they realize they have been spotted somewhere they should not be. He rolled down his window and called out a standard greeting, the kind of thing a conservation officer says a dozen times a day during firearm season. Nothing answered, and it was in the several seconds of silence that followed that Roger's eyes adjusted enough to understand that the shape at the tree line was too tall, through the shoulders and chest, to be wearing blaze-orange coveralls over ordinary clothing. He estimated the shoulder height, using the hemlock's low branches as a reference, the way he had trained himself to do over decades of estimating animal size in the field, at somewhere close to 7 feet. The head, in the fading light, showed the same elongated, forward-projecting profile that Neil would later describe from his own thermal scope sightings farther south. The animal did not move, for what Roger estimated afterward was somewhere between 15 and 20 seconds, standing with its head turned directly toward his idling truck. And then it simply was not there anymore. Not in a way Roger could describe as running or bolting, but in a way he struggled for years to put into words more precise than it left. The way you would describe someone stepping out of a doorway rather than an animal breaking for cover. Roger drove the remaining half-mile of the boundary road, with his heart rate elevated enough that he pulled over at the first turnout and sat with his hands on the wheel for several minutes before continuing his patrol. He did not radio it in. He had, by 2011, 17 years into his career, already internalized the same calculation Neil would later make independently to the south. There was no report he could file that would accomplish anything beyond raising permanent questions about his own judgment. And he had a family, a pension years from vesting fully, and a reputation in a small professional community that took decades to build and, based on the second-hand story he had been told about his own predecessor in the Yellow Dog District, could be dismantled in considerably less time than that. What Roger will say, when asked directly, is that the animal at that tree line did not read to him as threatening in the moment, despite its size, and despite the distance closing to something considerably less comfortable in his memory of it than it likely was in fact. It read, he says, as assessing him, watching to see what he would do, the way a landowner watches an unfamiliar vehicle that has slowed near a property line. That description, when Roger and Neil finally compared notes in 2023, matched almost precisely the posture Neil had attributed, from his own more distant thermal observations, to dogman activity he had occasionally glimpsed over the years in Baraga County, distinct in his experience from the far rarer signature he associated with the color itself, which neither man has ever claimed to have seen directly with unaided eyes. Roger's sighting appears, by both men's careful analysis, to have been a dogman rather than the larger animal responsible for the kill sites, a distinction that matters enormously to how they each understand the layered hierarchy of that landscape. Even the more frequently glimpsed of the two animals remains rare enough that a 31-year veteran conservation officer working the same 40 square miles for the majority of his career saw it clearly, with his own eyes, exactly once. The ethical question that has occupied both men most in their retirement, beyond the personal cost each has absorbed individually, is a version of the same question every witness in this line of research eventually confronts, sharpened here by the fact that what they are protecting is not one undocumented animal, but a layered ecosystem involving at least two, existing in an uneasy and only partially understood relationship with each other. Neither man believes formal disclosure, submitted through any channel either can imagine actually existing, would result in careful, responsible scientific investigation. Both have spent enough of their careers inside Michigan's wildlife management bureaucracy to know exactly what would happen instead. A public claim of an unclassified apex predator preying on an already unclassified cryptid, made by two retired conservation officers with genuine institutional credibility, would not generate a quiet, methodical field study. It would generate media attention neither man could control, an influx of amateur cryptid hunters and armed thrill-seekers into some of the last roadless old-growth forest remaining in the eastern United States, and, in both men's assessment, direct and lasting harm to a stretch of habitat that has survived this long, specifically because almost nobody goes there, and almost nobody who does go there talks about what they found. That calculation, arrived at independently by two men who spent 30 and 26 years respectively learning to trust their own field judgment above almost anything else, is the closest thing to a resolution either of them expects to reach. They are not asking anyone to believe them. They are not asking the Michigan DNR to create a new incident classification or fund a research program. Neither man believes the department has any genuine appetite to pursue what they are doing in sharing this account now, with their identities protected and the precise location of every kill site and recovery site withheld, is placing the weight of what they each carried alone for the better part of 2 decades. Somewhere it does not have to disappear entirely when they themselves are gone. Neil is in his late 50s, Roger is in his mid-60s. Both have thought, more than either particularly wants to admit, about what happens to 30 combined years of careful, disciplined field documentation if neither of them ever tells anyone, and both concluded, independently and then together, that the alternative felt like its own kind of failure. A different failure than the one they had spent their careers avoiding, but a failure all the same. The Huron Mountains and the country south of them, running down through the Ottawa National Forest into the Sturgeon River Gorge and the roadless interior of Baraga County, remain today almost exactly as remote and poorly understood as when Roger first walked the Yellow Dog Plains in 1994, and when Neil first knelt over a dead moose 11 miles south of Lance in 2006. The Huron Mountain Club continues to manage its 22,000 acres under the same restrictive access policies it has maintained for well over a century, an accident of private conservation that has done more, in Neil and Roger's shared assessment, to protect whatever moves through that corridor than any state or federal wildlife program ever has or ever could. The Keweenaw Bay Indian community continues to exercise its treaty-protected hunting and gathering rights across the interior, managing its relationship with that landscape according to a framework of knowledge that predates the state of Michigan by thousands of years, and that neither man, despite decades trying to understand it from the outside, ever fully accessed, nor do either of them believe they were entitled to. Somewhere within that 60-mile corridor, according to the combined weight of 2 independent, decades-long investigations, a dogman population persists, cautious, territorial, and rare enough that even officers who spent their entire careers in its range saw it clearly only a handful of times between them. And somewhere within the same corridor, rarer still and considerably more dangerous, something larger moves through the same old-growth hemlock and the same roadless drainages, killing efficiently when it kills at all, caching what it does not finish, ignoring or disabling the handful of cameras that have ever come close enough to matter, and maintaining, across nearly 3 decades of documented evidence, an unbroken record of never once, as far as either man has determined, turning that capacity for violence toward the 2 officers who spent the better part of their careers quietly documenting its existence from a respectful and unbridgeable distance. Neil told us, in the last conversation we had before this account went to print, that he does not think of the color as a monster, despite everything it did to the animals, and possibly to the dogman, whose remains he once knelt beside in a clearing above the Sturgeon River. He thinks of it the way he has come to think of the entire landscape he spent 26 years learning to read, as something operating according to a logic of its own, older than his badge, older than the treaties that drew the boundaries of the reservation and the national forest and the private clubland. Older, he suspects, than anything else currently living in that forest. He said the closest he has come to understanding his own relationship to it is the same relationship he has always had, since he was a boy running a trapline with his father along that same river to a landscape that never asked his permission to be exactly as vast and unknowable as it has always been. And that owes him, in the end, no explanation at all. If you take one thing away from what Neil and Roger spent a combined 3 decades documenting, let it be this. Every assumption you carry about what sits at the top of a given food chain is built on the incomplete information available to the people who mapped that hierarchy in the first place. And the Upper Peninsula, for all the surveying and all the wildlife management and all the generations of hunters and trappers who have walked it, remains a landscape large enough and wild enough to hold layers nobody has fully mapped. The Dogman itself unsettled an entire regional culture for decades before researchers like Linda Godfrey began taking witness accounts seriously enough to compile them into something resembling a coherent record. It has taken this long for 2 of the very people whose job it was to know that landscape better than anyone, to admit, even privately, even to each other, that the Dogman itself might not be the thing at the top. That is where Neil's story rests. Not resolved, not explained. A retired conservation officer with 26 years of institutional knowledge, 16 years of private documentation, and no forum anywhere in the state of Michigan willing or able to receive what he found, sitting with the knowledge that the woods he spent his entire career learning hold something at the very top of the food chain that nobody outside a small circle of retired wardens has ever been told exists, sharing that territory, uneasily, with the Dogman that the rest of us have spent decades arguing about, while something larger and quieter watches them both from deeper in the timber, and has, so far, been patient enough to let all of them, wardens and Dogmen alike, keep walking through its country a little while longer.